Hello, folks, and welcome to the Friend or Foe Lounge. I am your friendly neighborhood Shotcaster Shargan, and I have decided that we need to have a little bit of a workshop today. So I have brought in the three Joshes to talk draft prep, because I feel like that is one of the things where some of these teams have kind of had a little bit of struggles, where they've had some good decisions, some okay decisions, and some okay, you just counterpicked yourself decisions. So I want to hop right into this and just kind of like get going. I've already drafted up a couple of questions. So this is kind of the explain like I'm 5 years old and have never played League of Legends before. How do you first off decide what kind of a comp you're going to play? Josh, I'm going to go to you first.
That's
me?
You. Yes. Okay. Glad to know I'm the one who actually gets to use my real name at this point. I know I'm going to differ here from what a lot of other people think, but the idea of having an entire composition in mind before you actually start the draft is, I think, generally a bit of a mistake, right? And the reasons why like Rex has lost some of our games is because we've done that, and we've become overly rigid in what we were trying to draft. And you won't see it in this particular game, but you'll see in a couple of the other games that we end up dropping. And the big thing that you need to be looking at is, unless you have a very specific composition in mind that you think can take all comers, what we will generally do is we will try and come up with a very solid 3 champions that can shift into a number of different styles based on what we're able to do in our first 3 picks. And once you do that, you see what the opponents are trying to do, and then by like your 4th and 5th pick, that's when you're forced to commit into one direction or another. So in general, we don't have a strong plan beyond our first 3 picks almost any time that we go into the game.
And then it's like, I'm guessing Ahntye and Utility Monster, you guys have kind of the same sort of philosophy. You're doing the same thing there?
Actually, not quite. I think that for us, it really depends on the teams, because the thing is, drafting is not just the drafting phase, right? So everything that goes into draft is the information you have about the enemy team and the enemy team's players beforehand. So if you know the enemy team likes to play a certain way, then you can draft a composition around that. Or if they play certain champions, you can draft around that. So I think that, first you want to get your champions that's like, hey, you can just kind of slot this into everything. They're strong, and same idea. You pick, 2 or 3 champions that are very flexible and can transition into a lot of different styles and team compositions. But this isn't Overwatch. We're not playing goats. You can't slot one composition into every single possible iteration that the enemy team can do, unless you're just that much better than them. And if you're that much better than them, just have what you want at that point.
Yeah,
just pick. But
there's at least one team in both leagues that teams do that against.
Yeah. But the big thing is that a lot of it is, if you do want to go into it with a certain composition in mind, you have to have a good reason as to why you want to do that. Like, for example, if a team is very, very focused on team fighting and that's all they draft for, right? Because if they're trapped into the mindset of you have to draft for a certain style, then you can be like, okay, well, we'll just 1-3-1 or 1-4 and draft something specifically to counter their play style and the champions that they play. And especially because, we're not playing at the professional level, there are certain champions that end up becoming blind pickable because that the enemy team doesn't play the counters. But all of it is going to rely on how much information you have about the enemy team and the enemy team's players before the game starts. So drafting starts before draft.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, drafting does not start with the first spin. It starts with, what does everyone on my team play and what does everyone on their team play? Because if you look at a professional game, they skip that part when they talk about who, is winning draft, or, who had a great draft or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, of course, they just whipped out this thing that's really good. But that's because they're professionals who played the game for 12 hours a day and can play anything. At this level of play, most people, ostensibly, maybe not literally everything, but a lot. Whereas at this level, it's like, I play a couple hours a day because I don't actually have a life. That would be a lie. But everyone else on my team has a life. And so they only play the game a couple hours a day. And so it's like, they play 10 champions. It's like, well, that's not bad. I mean, 10 champions is a lot, but that's also not literally everything in the game. And most of our opponents are the same way. It's like, oh, I can just look at their solo queue, and that's what they play. And if they're playing anything else, they have never played it before. So you sort of start from a very limited point of view on what is possible in the game compared to a lot of what you would think about. I mean, there's 150 champions in the game, but like, if in this game only 30 of them or 40 of them can show up, it's a lot easier of a thing to deal with.
Okay. Yeah, that honestly, that answers like kind of like the basic question of like just in the very beginning. So this, it's kind of like you guys are doing your draft prep ahead of time, like looking at op.ggs and things like that. So how does that exactly factor into what your ban choices are going to be? Because you've only got 5 bans. Are you guys deciding one per player? Is it targeting a specific player who like seems to have a higher performance? Where exactly is it that you guys kind of try to focus whenever going on that? I've actually got the Rex Regalis versus RLS game playing here. So if you want to use this as an example.
This one is tough to use as an example of that topic, but this draft is worth looking at again later on. So I'll start with like the basic questions like what is the theory behind ban choices? And so at our level of play, let me back up even higher. At the highest level of play, you will notice that teams ban almost exclusively very meta picks. Whatever is considered good at the time, they ban those. And as you start going further and further down, you will start seeing more and more bans that are not quite as meta. And the reason is because the players can't play the things that are super meta, or they can't play it in a way that's going to be super threatening. And so what that ends up doing is you end up banning things that your opponents are really good at. And I think there are 2 things that we look at our level, at least that I look at. One, what is contested in this draft, right? Do both teams play a certain champion, and do they both play it well? Do both teams want to have this champion on their team? And then we either need to look at, okay, are we going to be able to get this champion, or do we need to ban it, or what are we going to be getting in compensation? So if you can't get any compensation for it, you just ban it out. The other thing, the second thing that we look at is, are there any one tricks or, 3 or fewer tricks, right? And I think we saw this really heavily with STC, where I'm Soloing realistically played 3 champions. And after that, his RA was nowhere near as good as his Yasuo, Yone, Zed. So he just banned those 3 out. He's, he goes from being, I think he's like a mid-platinum player to at best like high gold, right? And if you can do that to a player, that is a huge downgrade. So that's the second thing you look for, is can you eliminate a player with just 1 or 2 bans? And then the third thing is, do they play anything weird, or do they play anything that is compositionally defining, right? Like if you look at this, Ahntye has spent a lot of time saying, like, you cannot give Joushi, me, a champion that is going to be able to escape the laning phase and have this big team fight deciding ultimate. And that's why he's banning both Gnar and Ornn, because I can get through almost any laning phase with these 2 champions and then have a huge impact in the team fights.
Yeah, and it's also going to depend on how these players play to their team. For example, if we look at other teams like, I forget which team was made in OP on. I believe
PTP.
That was PTP. Yeah. So PTP, made in OP is their top laner and plays largely Kled and Yorick. Hence the name made in OP. So if you take away those 2 champions, you see that their performance tends to drop off quite a bit. So as far as draft goes, if you're planning on winning that game rather than using it for learning or practicing or something else, right? For example, scrims are very different from on stage. But if you plan on banning those 2 out, the thing about bans is that you want it to have as much impact on the enemy team as possible in comparison to how much of an advantage it gives you. For example, there's a lot of games where, we'll have 1 or 2 players in a position where it's like, okay, well, if we ban out their comfortable picks, then our player will be on a significantly more comfortable position and have the potential to carry from there. And it's not that we don't think they can handle those comfort picks. It's that by taking those away, you can put yourself in a position where you're expected to have a lead and get ahead.
Yeah, I went ahead and pulled up one of those particular games right here. So we've got, this is RLS, and it was a game that you weren't present for, Ahntye. And I know you do a massive amount of the draft prep.
This was a very interesting one because I did a few hours of draft prep before leaving to go camping. And then I came back and I saw a completely different draft than I had suggested. What this one turned into was our team had already realized, hey, you know, we're basically guaranteed for playoffs. So since we don't really have too much time to practice different team compositions and other things like that, then why not use this as essentially a scrim on stage? Which is the reason why, you know, you have different bands. You don't see the Yorick or the Kled band coming out. You do see the Kled.
The Kled comes out towards the end, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the Amumu band was let through for sure. Like, I know that's one of those contested ones that Joushi mentioned. Like, you either get some kind of compensation, or you ban it.
Yeah, and you know, you let the Amumu through, and then we take a Feli Thresh. Which, one other thing, right? If you're red side, you can totally pick a solo laner on 3. That is a really, really good time to pick a solo lane.
That actually brings up something that I forgot to mention is like, because I just kind of glazed over this. There's a difference between what you're picking and banning on red side versus when you're on blue side, right?
Absolutely.
So what's kind of the theory behind red versus blue picks and bans? Like, it's like, obviously when you've got, because just the nature of the draft and how it plays out, like that's obviously where the big game changes can happen.
I don't think it's that different. So, well, okay, the result is different. I don't think the thought process is different. I think that you're going in with, we want to, whenever we don't see the matchup that we're against, we want to take something that's either very safe into almost anything, we're confident in almost anything, or something that's a flex. So if they pick something that's terrible for us in one lane, we can put it in the other lane, or if they pick something that's terrible for us in both lanes, at least we see both and we can counterpick one of them until we both get one good matchup, one bad matchup. The difference between blue and red side is just the number of those that you're getting. So on blue side, you're picking first, but you end up only getting, assuming both teams are always counterpicking what they see, you get 2 counterpicks and red side gets 3. And red side also gets a little bit of an edge because they get super last pick, but they also get, like Ahntye was saying, they get 3rd pick, double ban 4th pick. So you can sort of do some clever things where you pick something and then ban both the counters to it, or you pinch a roll and then pick the 3rd one. So you can do some things there. But the thought process of what do I want is always the same. It's always, I want the things that are the strongest. And if I don't know what I'm against, I'm picking something that is safe or flexible. And if I do know what I'm against, I'm picking the thing I play that is the best against that.
Yeah, the one other thing I would say is that this changes at the highest level, right? When you are on red side, your top lane is inherently more easily diveable, right? It's just a thing that is true because of the way that the geography of the map works. But nobody at our level is good enough to actually do anything with that. It's why you tend to see Gnar way more often on the blue side than on the red side. It's because it's harder to dive Gnar on blue side than it is on red side, and Gnar tends to die a lot on the red side at the highest level. But at our level of play, it doesn't really make a difference. So a lot of the things that you see like professional teams think about is like, is this champion good on this side or that side of the map, doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And so I agree with Josh about a lot of the things that they've said.
I think that when you look at, if most people's exposure to draft is like the professional scene and like people analyzing those games, stuff like that, because that's really the only sort of widely available 5-on-5 environment where prep matters a lot. But when you're looking at that, you should really think through why people are like the thought process for why people are saying, oh, here's why we're doing this or here's why we're doing that, and actually kind of ignore what they say, because what they say is very dependent on all these assumptions they're making about their players and the level of skill in the game that don't apply. So why they draft the way they do, very important to understand and sort of try and get a handle on. And it's interesting if you care about drafting. It's very strategic and fun. But what they say, like, oh, you can't pick Gnar on red side. Well, you can. Like that part is because they've made a bunch of assumptions about what their players are capable of that don't apply.
Yeah. I'll say one other thing about the professional scene before we like kind of come back down towards our goal platinum leagues mostly. you see a really heavy convergence at the top, where people will play. All teams will kind of play the same champions because they agree on the meta. And a big part of this that is not talked about is it'll be somebody at the top level will be really fucking sick at some champion. Let's just say it's Lee Sin. Somebody is really sick at Lee Sin, and they are so good at Lee Sin that everybody needs to figure out what is playable into Lee Sin and what is not playable into Lee Sin. And you are then encouraged to have your players also pick up Lee Sin, so that you can use it effectively as a fourth ban, right? On blue side, if you can ban 1, 2, 3, and then pick Lee Sin, even if your Lee Sin isn't quite as sick as their Lee Sin is, suddenly they are no longer playing Lee Sin. And so it ends up creating a situation where professional players are playing strong champions most of the time, but it's also a big reason why, we see a world, nobody was playing Yuumi before World started, and now people are picking it blind on the first pick in the draft. It's because even though that they are playing a lot of strong characters, until somebody shows that this pick is super sick and they are good at it, or that it is super easy to execute, people are not going to shift to what else is strong. And so that's why you see this like really heavy convergence at the top level that you really don't see at our level, because we just don't have the time to do that. If I was playing against RLS and I had 12 hours a day to play, you bet your ass I would be picking up sets so I can take it away from Ahntye.
But that's exactly the type of concept that you should not first pick Yuumi because the pros are first picking Yuumi. But what you should do is you should first pick characters that we both play, that we both agree are really strong. So if Amumu support is a good example of that. Everyone in this league, as far as I'm aware, is picking Amumu. And it's like, the ultimate's really good. It's amazing CC. It's really easy to execute. It's just probably the strongest bot lane engage tank. So Amumu first pick, even if your Amumu is worse than their Amumu, you're first picking Amumu, right? Like that's a very reasonable thing. So even though the exact champion that the pros are doing doesn't apply, the general reasoning of, we just pick the thing that we both play that we want to make sure they don't have, that does apply. So the reasoning behind it applies even if the exact specifics don't.
And one of the big things is, if you're on blue side, you want to use your bans to skew the draft in order to allow you to have that one single OP champion. And on red side, you want to try to skew it so that way you can pick up a really strong combo if possible. Like, for example, Syndra Xin Zhao, which is something that was very strong at the beginning of the FoF season, which is kind of falling off after a few nerfs, but still very strong combo. Syndra sets up for Xin Zhao, Xin Zhao sets up for Syndra, and taking that on R1, R2 ends up being very powerful.
Well, we can get into what champions are actually strong. I don't think Syndra Xin Zhao is strong.
It wasn't. I think it could be definitely argued it was at the beginning. I'm not too sure about it anymore.
Well, I do have a ideal draft at the end, and so like we can get into it there for sure.
But the first step is figuring out the champions. But the second step is actually doing the draft. So you've banned the things that they play that either you don't or you don't want to prioritize, and that you banned away their 1 tricks or 2 tricks. You first picked the things that are strong and blind. You're counter picking with the best thing you play. So the next logical step is, well, how do I figure this stuff out? Because like no one tells you what counters what. Like some things are obvious, like Malphite counters AD auto attackers, sure, but like does Camille or I don't know Aatrox win? I have no clue.
Yeah, that's honestly that's a good point. So you got to figure out how
probably. So the easiest thing to do is, well, first of all, talk to whoever's playing that lane in your team because they probably have an opinion. But the second easiest thing to do is just check the internet. So check some stats site.
Go to like, op.gg or something like that. And, or
lolalytics.com, UGG. I prefer Lolalytics personally, but you can find all sorts of stats websites. Pick one.
When you don't know, there's always 2 ways to find out. Yeah. One is grind it out, figure it out yourself. The second is just ask someone who knows more. And Google tends to know a lot.
And I was gonna say,
the internet knows a lot about League of Legends because it's purely just the numbers. So like there might be the thing to know is that it's not like a guarantee. So there are exceptions, there are statistical biases, but that doesn't mean that the numbers, like you should trust the numbers by default. And you should have a really good reason. If the internet says that Aatrox wins 60% of the time, you should have a really, really good reason to think that that's because Aatrox players suck or Camille players are really bad in solo queue, but this one's really good. Like you have to have a really compelling reason to override the internet. So the internet's a really easy place to like, I don't know what beats what. Just check the internet. It takes like 5 minutes.
I think the Reddit mains are probably the best place.
They're also good, but that takes a lot of time, and sometimes they're dumb.
Sometimes they have really hot takes, and you're like, wait, hold on a second.
Yeah. So I will say, Utility Monster and I have talked about the value of analytics and stat sites a lot.
We had like an 8-hour argument starting at midnight and ending at 8 in the morning one time. About the usefulness of lawlytics.com.
Why did you not record this?
Because it was fucking midnight, and it's 8 hours. You want to listen to us? We're both fucking delirious at that point. Anyway, the thing I'll say is, I'll start by saying yes, I agree. Use these stats websites; they are a pretty good resource. But the bigger thing that I'm going to say is that I'm going to disagree with him on is you need to understand why these numbers are the way they are, right? And also understand. And the argument that I make that Utility Monster is going to disagree with is if something is within a given percentage, I'll usually use about 2 or 3 percentage points. If it's within about 2 or 3 percentage points, but you prefer to play a different way, especially on the short term, right? If you prefer to play this way and, Lolalytics says that taking this item loses you 2 or 3 percentage points in your winning state, it doesn't matter. You're currently sitting on a hill where deviating from your current playstyle is going to make you worse than the immediate, and you're trying to win this game. You're not trying to win 52 of the next 100 games. You're trying to win one game. So you do need to understand that the things that you do, even if they are statistically suboptimal, in the immediate, you need to understand that you need to play to win now, not necessarily over the long aggregate.
We mostly agree on that. I think conceptually we just differ on like how big of an effect that is. I tend to think that the statistics are like right almost every time, and Joushi is much more willing to say, well, it's close enough that I'm gonna go with this thing I prefer. I think as long as you're using the statistics as a baseline, that's the more important part. The much more important thing is I'm bothering to check what my baseline assumption should be, and I'm deviating because I think something. If you have a reason to deviate from that, we can disagree about whether it's a good reason, but like you should have a reason to deviate is basically the main takeaway.
All I'll really say is that meta means most effective tactic available, and if you can't play everything, then the most effective tactic available isn't going to be the most effective tactic in the game. It's going to be the most effective amongst what you're used to.
I think that is a great comment, right? Like just straight up like that. That is real. So you kind of already gone over this then, like kind of like, 'cause I was going to ask you about like flexing around bans and stuff kind of. So let's like hop into this another set of questions that I had. So it's like let's say you've picked out your team comp, like you know what you want to do. How do you determine what your win condition or conditions are in the draft phase prior to actually getting onto the Rift, before it starts to evolve and you start getting punched in the teeth and the plane goes out the window?
I don't think you do. I think that your win conditions are determined when your draft is done, or mostly done. I mean, at some level, like you should be committed to as little as possible while drafting is still happening in game. Right, you want to make your in-game plan based on as much information as possible, and that is when the draft is fully complete. That doesn't mean that you should have like no clue. Like, we drafted this really early Vayne, and it's like, we're just not gonna play for both side ever. Like, screw this Vayne. She can go 2v2. Good luck. Like, no. Like, of course you're doing that. So when you are drafting, you are committing to like, we are doing at least the bare minimum to make this character a part of the game. But you shouldn't be like hard committing to like, we first pick Vayne. That means that we're going to draft a jungler that's going to level 2 gank bottom lane, and we're hard committed to that from first pick. Like, you should not do that, because there are other ways to support, this Vayne you've theoretically picked.
I would say that when it does come to drafting for those sort of things, one thing that's a general guideline that's pretty helpful is you don't want to split the lanes that you want to gank. Like, if you draft a strong bot lane, you don't also want to draft a top lane that needs jungle pressure, right? You don't want jungle pressure required on both sides of the map. So, if you have something strong mid lane that can do well with the jungle and something strong bot lane, you have it towards the bottom half of the map rather than having it specifically for side lanes. Unless you're playing something like Nunu, who just kind of eats side lanes alive, it's something that you want to keep in mind. And it's also why, if you look at the PTP RLS game, the draft that's over here, when I got back, I was very confused about it, because On R1, R2, you see Helios and Thresh, which are a very good combo in the bot lane, very lane dominant, but also tends to draw a lot of jungle pressure from both sides. And then immediately after that, you see Darius, which is another lane dominant pick that also tends to draw jungle pressure. So because of that, the jungle pressure gets split between two separate lanes on opposite sides of the map, and it becomes much more difficult to execute from the side of RLS in this particular situation. And one of the big things about that is when you have all 5 champions, I think the first thing that's easiest to do is just say, okay, well, do we outscale? And if you do outscale, you could transition your game plan to the next question you can ask yourself is, well, what does the enemy team want to do in order to succeed, right? Do they have a strong mid laner or a strong top laner, right? And if you do outscale, your game plan transitions away from, well, this is what we need to do to succeed, and more of, this is what we need to do to make sure the enemy team cannot succeed. Because if you outscale, your win condition is just survive.
Yeah. I think a great term for that is understanding your loss condition, right? And sometimes your loss condition is, well, if our Helios is weak, we cannot play the game, right? And so you need to do something in order to make sure that your Helios is not weak, right? And so this is a situation where, because the map is super split, Darius wants a lot of attention, Helios Thresh want a lot of attention, and it's kind of okay because you have like Lilia and Akshan, and Akshan's going to be trying to roam quite a bit. It's a situation where you need to, if you have decided that you outscale, you're going to be taking time to make sure that you don't meet any of your loss conditions. And to go off of that, there's a difference between saying, hey, we outscale, let's not do anything, versus, hey, we outscale, let's make sure that we are preventing our opponent from getting anything for free, right? It's very different to play passively versus to play defensively. And I think that's something a lot of teams kind of fail at. But the big thing, after jumping off of Ahntye's point that I look at when determining win conditions is you look at your 5 champions, you look at their 5 champions. And if you look at all of them individually, it's nice. But the way that I tend to look at it is our 5 champions as a whole, if you average out all of their power curves over the course of a game, will tend to converge around some minute point, right? Or some item break point, right? Like maybe even though we have a Kog'Maw who really wants 4 items, we still have to fight at 2 because that's when our mid lane or top lane are going to be at their strongest. So you need to find a situation where when you're strong and when your playmaking window really is, and tend to play towards that. And what Rex tends to do is we try and find compositions that are going to be really strong around somewhere between the 1.5 to 2.5 items, because that's when most games are decided, right? That's when you tend to fight around the dragon. That's when you tend to fight around the Rift Heralds. And if you can find a large enough advantage there, it kind of doesn't matter if your opponents outscale you if you just have a really large gold lead.
And so earlier we were talking about how we don't think that you should come into draft. I think we all agree that you shouldn't come into draft with we're going to pick these 5 champions because these 5 characters are the best thing to beat this team with, because A, they can ban some of them, and then what are you going to do? And B, it's there's so many things that they could do that suddenly maybe you want a different 5 champions. So you want to come in with, we think these things are the defaults, but maybe there's something else. And so we have to change our minds quickly in draft. But what you should do, absolutely, is you should say, okay, all the characters we play, you should group them into okay, so these characters work together, these characters work together, and work together is usually strong at similar times in the game, because that it doesn't usually matter. You want to have similar win conditions too. You don't want to pick strong because they team fight and strong because they're never team fighting. But usually if they're strong at the same point in the game, that's good enough, because you just don't want to have the case where someone wants to fight at 1 item and someone wants to scale to 6. Then it's well, these champions kind of never want to do the same thing, and it's a constant tension of when is it right to do one or the other? And it always is right to do one or the other. It's just really hard to figure it out in game. It's well, we're at 3 items, so the 1 item champion's falling off, but the carry's almost there, and is that enough to fight yet or no? It's who cares? Just only pick champions that are strong at 1, or only strong at 5, or whatever. do something where everyone's on the same page compositionally, so that everyone on the team knows, okay, so we're defensively till this point, then we're playing aggressively because we're all strong, then we're playing defensively for another 5 minutes, then we're aggressive again because we hit another break point. Like, you should have a rough sense of when you want to be strong, and when you want to be strong is entirely up to team preference. So Ahntye is saying you can scale. That means that you want to be generally the team that is strong after your opponent. So you're going to stall them out till you get to your break point, which is better than theirs. The alternative is the way that I prefer to play, and Team UB prefers to play, which is you're the beatdown team. You're the team that's like, we're going to be strong first, and we're going to be so strong that we're going to wipe you off the map before you hit your break point. And then it doesn't matter when you hit your items because we're just so far ahead. So those are sort of the very high level, the two ways to play in terms of time is, are you slightly faster or slightly slower? And depending on what that is, that means you have to play defensively or play more proactively. But you want to have most of your team be on that same page. And I think that teams where you have, one hyper carry as insurance and then everyone else is super early game, I think those actually don't make that much sense, because suddenly you have this hyper carry that isn't supporting your main team objective. And maybe there are exceptions where it's like, okay, it can be really good to, funnel some hyper carry or whatever. But for the most part, you want everyone on the same page in terms of when you're strong. And then the secondary thing is, okay, so we're strong at the same time. Now do we want to do the same thing? And I think usually, yes. Usually most games in League of Legends are won by fighting. There's some exceptions with split pushing comps, but I think for the most part, especially with how strong a lot of the neutral objectives are, you're talking about when you're strong fighting, and split pushing is more a means to get a more favorable fight than it is like win condition in itself.
Yeah,
I will say that the idea of having a hyper carry and slotting that into a composition where you have a few strong early laners, one of the things for that is that if you have strong early laners, generally, right, you are getting priority with those laners. And one of the big things about draft is, do you have lane priority? Because if you draft 3 losing lanes, your jungler is not going to be allowed to play the game as long as the enemy jungler knows what they're doing, because they're just going to walk in and take absolutely everything. And congratulations, now you're playing a 4v5. And the thing about a hyper carry needing, not necessarily needing, but benefiting from strong early laners is less of whether or not they want to actually fight early on, but more of the strong early champions are there to allow the game to get to the point where the hyper carry can do the hyper carry. It's less
we call that a bridge.
It's less of the hyper carry not necessarily wanting the same thing as those, and those champions basically being sacrificed for the sake of the hyper carry.
That's fair, but I think that in that case, you're being very clear that we're picking these characters that are not at their strongest at the same point, but they're playing around the hyper. Like, we're still fighting at 4 items, 5 items with this hyper carry. We're just picking like the bare minimum to get there. So there's a distinction between what you're saying and like just picking it because we like the characters, right? Like you're very strategically saying, okay, so we want to play around this hyper carry, and so we can't pick 5 champions that are strong at 5 items. So there are limitations in terms of getting to 5 items. And similarly, you can't pick 5 champions that are strong at like 1 item, because it's really, really like pro level maybe, but it's really hard to win the game super, super hard by 10, 15 minutes. So you want to have some, bare minimum of like, we can realistically win the game or not lose the game in this time. But that's still strategically thinking we're playing big picture, we're playing for this power spike.
And building off of what you were saying earlier, as long as everyone's on the same page going into it, you should be put into a good position here. Like Jack Xander, our Les's coach, he is primarily a Dota player, and there's an interesting concept what he introduced to us, which is the position system. So in Dota, to my limited understanding, there are different positions, and position 1 gets all the gold and all the resources, basically. And in game and in the draft, right, you have your designated position 1 champion. For example, if you have a Kog'Maw, that's pretty much always going to default to position 1. But if you're in the early game, Kog'Maw doesn't actually do that much. So Kog'Maw's not going to be able to have the most team fights impact. So you play as if another champion who's might be stronger early on your team is the position 1 for those fights. But as the game transitions on, you hit your item breakpoints, and as long as everyone's on the same page, hey, this team fight we peel for the cog, or this team fight we play around Set or Ornn or something crazy like that.
So who would that
And-
be in this particular case right here? Like with the draft that you've got with the Ziggs, Leo, Voli, Orianna, Trundle.
It starts off with Volibear. Volibear is your
Yes.
position 1
Yes,
for the
absolutely.
first like 15 minutes. And then after that, it transitions to whichever is strong between Ziggs and Orianna.
Okay.
I would say it transitions to Orianna almost every single time, and Ziggs is almost, but I think Ziggs is position 2 the entire game.
And would it be kind of, I guess, would Tom
Kinda depends
Kench
on the
be
game.
the case for Rex in this instance? Or is
No.
it,
No.
not at
No.
all?
Zinzhou.
Okay. So-
Zinzhou.
Zinzhou,
Zinzhou
yeah.
is 100% our position 1 for the beginning of the game. We want to try and make him strong so that he can get us to a spot where, in our ideal situation, Zoe becomes our position 1 because she is so strong that she just kills everybody on her own. That's something that Varus can basically never do. So, Zinzhou is ideally a position 1, and in an ideal world, Zoe transitions into our position 1, and Varus kind of sits at position 2 about the entire game.
Which is why the Trundle pick was so instrumental in this game, because Trundle as a champion, is designed to counter champions like Xin Zhao, where early dueling and ganking lanes,
The chomping, the
Sucked my toe.
subjugating.
the munching, basically, right? So the reason why this draft worked so well is because the Trundle pick was specifically designed to shut down the enemy's position 1 champion, and then eventually scale into later, which is once again referring to as having everyone on the same page.
It's a similar idea in like bot lanes picking, Caitlyn to hypercarry. Like you're just gonna beat them in lane so hard they never get going. And so Trundle really does that well into sort of melee divers because he takes so many of their stats that they can't effectively function as a position 1. So that's a great example of a counter pick. And Ahntye earlier was talking about priority and how you need priority in lanes. You also need that in the jungle to some extent. But a really easy sort of proxy for priority is, again, just going to the internet and seeing what wins more of the time. Yeah. So probably beats Zinzhou more of the time, just statistically. And so that's a great proxy for, well, he probably, has more priority, or is it, counters
Better
what Zinzhou's trying to
fighter,
do.
better jungle clear. He's got something that makes him.
Or in this case, he stops Zinzhou from doing what Zinzhou is trying to do to win the game, because Zinzhou is such an early game, priority champion that if you can stop him from doing that, suddenly he is a lot less useful later in the game. So that's a good example of when you could use a pretty easy number like who wins more and put it in this case.
Okay. No, that honestly, there's a lot of information in there that I think is really important, and a lot of stuff that's really good to go over. And one of the things that kept coming up was team comp, and you mentioned split pushing, team fighting. So like we've all, I'm sure everyone's heard the term 1-3-1. Everyone's heard that. Everyone's heard the term split pushing. Not everyone really has a good understanding of what exactly that means. And just kind of looking at these two comps right here, what kind of a name would you give these to kind of designate as what their ultimate objective is?
Well, I said earlier, I don't think in the current season, with how strong a lot of objectives are that you have to show up for at some point, I don't think there's such a thing as like a true split push comp in the same way that there might have been 5 years ago, where like you can win the game because someone is in his side lane killing every tower in the Nexus by themselves. Like maybe in your solo queue game, your Nasus gets 1,000 stacks and he does that, but realistically, that's not how you're going to win games. Yeah. So what realistically is going to happen though is you're going to be okay. So we're stronger in a side lane, and we can force the enemy team to be in a position that makes fights worse for them, and then we come back to the thing that we care about: the Baron, the Dragon, the Tower, another lane, whatever. So it's not about winning the game off of split pushing or poking or all these other types of team comps. It's about how do we take a fight on the most favorable terms. And I think that's a lot of people when they think 1-3-1, it's like, oh, we have to kill the inhibitors with our split pushers or else we're going to lose the game. It's like, no, you just force them into the lane all the way into their inhibitor, and you run away back to Dragon, and they have to run from their inhibitor to Dragon, and they can't get there in time. So it's more about how you're fighting, and not about what and how you're getting to these favorable 5-on-5 fights, because almost every game is headed by a 5-on-5 fight. So you should be thinking about, how do I take a favorable 5-on-5 fight, and not about how do I win the game.
Because a lot of split pushing, right, is about drawing pressure and drawing other people to those lanes. And once you've done that, that's something that they have to do reactively. So you gain tempo. And when you have tempo, you can do things proactively. You can proactively go to the dragon and set up vision early on, and you can take a favorable 5v5 fight in the choke. It all starts from understanding that, if you're split pushing, you are pressuring. You're not necessarily there to take the tower. You're there to draw a person. And if they don't put a person there, you do take the objective.
So in this case, Volibear probably has pressure on Tahm Kench outside of the super early game. Is that fair?
I believe so.
Okay, so
yeah.
So, but Tahm Kench is like pretty hard to break down. So he's pretty resilient, so he's going to be hard to push in. But Volibear has some level of pressure inside lanes to be able to sort of force Tahm Kench back and then collapse back to an objective with his team. So that's sort of how RLS's comp is trying to do it. The bigger way they're trying to do that actually though is with their double mages. They're trying to show up to a lane with double mages and really like kill all the minions really, really quickly and force Rex to then have to put Zoe and Varus to slowly clear out these minions, and in that time they can do whatever they want. And that's what, again, that Ahntye said, that's tempo. Tempo is sort of, I mean, I think everyone knows what it is intuitively, but I think of it as a temporary gold lead because someone's not there or someone's there late, and so you have a window where effectively they're down gold even if the champion's still in the game, not dead, and you don't actually have a gold lead. Like for 20 seconds you're up gold in some area in the map. And so you can use your pushing advantage or your split pushing advantage to sort of create that, and then you get little wins like wards or big wins like barons. Okay.
So that, in a way, based off that explanation, it kind of makes my next question a little bit moot, which was going to be ideal team comps, which apparently is very opponent based. Like what you want to take against your opponent is going to matter quite a bit more. Like it's like who you're up against rather than just ideally what your team is. But so I guess in a way,
if you're a team of 5 1-tricks, you have an ideal team comp. You'll get one trick.
Yeah, exactly.
But most of the time, it's what are they picking and what's the best thing I pick in this situation? And usually you have a pretty good idea. Like they play mostly AD Bruiser, so I play Shen and Ornn, and those just survive all those matchups really easily and then show up to team fights better. So maybe it's something like that where it's like, oh, we're always picking Shen and Ornn because they can only play AD Bruisers. And
well, in that case, my question, I guess, would be, we'll just kind of go down the row here, starting with Joushi. What is kind of your favorite team comp to run then? Like, what is something that you go in looking for, and like ideally every game would be this way, and this is the kind of game you would play?
I would prefer not to answer that at this time.
At this time, because we're going into playoffs. Well, so I'm not asking. Okay, so
I can actually answer this because last season I published our team's draft spreadsheet in the Discord, so like everyone can look up.
You did do that. You did release all the stats.
Yeah, so everyone can look up how we scouted all the other teams. Like we have what we think their champion pools are, and then all our draft plans for like what we're banning, what we're picking into what, and all the. We don't say why in the spreadsheet, but all the whys are, I looked it up on the internet and they play these 5 champions. I just go to like some website, look up countered by, and then I find the things that our mid laner plays on the countered by list. So like, okay, great. We're picking these 3 kings because they counter that champion. Great. We're done. Like, it's really easy when you hear about it. It's like, that's it. Like, yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good place to start.
Yeah. It's kind of funny to me because a lot of the counter picks that we prepare in RLS are actually just stuff that I say, where I'm just like, hey, you should pick up this, and there's like, why? And it's like, because this pick that's resurging, it was strong in 2015, and this was the counter back then.
Yeah, way to go about it.
And
it's a good start. It's a good start.
A lot of it is actually just me going back off of my old League of Legends knowledge. Like, we were the first team to start picking Amumu MF, and the reason why we started doing that was because I started seeing UB playing a little bit of Amumu support, and the first thing that instantly pops into my head is, oh, we could just do Curse of the Sad Bullet time.
Yep.
And I just remember the old Cloud9 compositions, and it's like, okay, well, the internet doesn't necessarily need to tell me this, but
it's actually a Gambit composition. M5.
I see.
Yeah.
So I knew it was a loaded question to ask that.
The thing is about like the compositions that Rex is looking to play is that they are not currently meta.
I see what you're
Right.
saying.
And in fact, RLS might be the only team that has seen us do either of the primary strategies we're looking to play in playoffs.
Okay.
Wow.
That'll be something exciting to see.
Should I know any of
Yeah.
this because I'm potentially your sub jungler?
We can talk about it later. Yeah.
Anyway, no, so I can talk about it, especially from last season, because most of our champion pools are pretty similar. So we like on UB, we like to be the team that has the pressure. We are the earlier spiking team. We're the beatdown team, because we like fighting people, and it's a lot easier to fight people when you're strong first.
Right.
That way, your thought process is usually not, are we stronger yet? It's, we can just always fight them. That's a really easy shortcut, and we really like fighting people, so that's the shortcut that we take. But because of that, what we're looking to do is to pick as much as possible, especially because our bot lane is so strong. We're trying to sort of pick a strong bot lane for early fights, pick a top lane that ideally it wins on its own, but most of the time it's just even, sort of safe, does its thing, and then is a strong team fighter. So, Freelancer plays like Cho'Gath, and it's like, well, Cho'Gath just sort of shows up to team fights and he's really tanky, and that's always useful. So it's not, we're talking earlier about power spike. Cho'Gath's sort of like a very flat power spike in a sense. Like, yeah, he's stronger at some points in the game, weaker some points in the game, but like he can sort of always fight and it's fine. So it's a really easy thing to pick. Or Shen, similar thing. Like you can always just ult to a fight. And it's like, well, you're never sad that you had a Shen in the fight. Like, okay. So we pick something sort of that can always fight in top lane. I pick a bot lane that's always stronger, and then sort of pick mid jungle to round out a composition with like, okay, well, bot lane wants to fight this way, so let's pick a mid laner that holds him down in place for misfortune to ult him, or a mid laner that creates chaos so that Vayne can tumble around invisible and kill everyone, or whatever. But we're trying to spike early, and because we're spiking early, that means we have to get an advantage early, otherwise we'll lose the game. So we have to, take these early fights at dragons, and so we're strategically like, well, okay, so how do we get to the early dragon in a place where we're stronger, and how do we get the lane? So everything sort of flows from the fact that we know we are stronger early, and we have to take advantage of that.
Okay.
And so ideally we're picking like a lot of Galio, because Galio is really strong early. He offers a lot of crowd control early. He's low damage later in the game, but he's not low damage early. And we'll pick Galio into a lot of things. So maybe our ideal team comp just always has a Galio in it, because we would love to just always fight around when Galio is strong. We picked a lot of Lethality Sivir last year. It's like, why? Well, because Lethality Sivir is really, really strong at 2 items. So as far as AD carry wake-ups go, most AD carries need Infinity Edge, which is a 3rd item, and it's really expensive. So if you can be strong at 2, you can take a ton of fights before they get to 3 and try and put them in the dirt before they get there. And then, they get there eventually, but if you're up 10,000 gold when they get there, it doesn't matter. So so we're like, our last year we sort of had the ideal team comp. Actually, it was Galio mid, Lethality Sivir bottom, Maokai, which was our flex pick, but we liked it both support and top. So say Maokai support, that was Brian's most played. Like, I don't know, some team fighting, Wukong or Shen top, and then literally any jungler that engages. That was our ideal team comp. So we had it, but it's not because we come into the draft saying, oh, we're just going to pick these 5 characters. It just happens that, okay, so we like to pick, Galio and some tank top blind, and then the way that we like to play, Sivir, Maokai, and any jungler tend to be strong with it. So you can have an ideal team comp in that sense, but like if our opponent picks something that's really, really good into, like Mordekaiser is really good into a lot of team fighting top laners, because he forces them to duel in 1v1, and it's like, well, you can't team fight anymore. So if our opponent picks Mordekaiser, we're not going to be like, oh, well, we're still walking in the Shen, baby. Like, right. Like, we're not doing that. So, we're not hard committed to like, oh, we're picking these 5 characters no matter what. But we did have an ideal team comp, and I think we still play that way to a large extent this season. So yeah,
okay,
ban those champions. Good luck.
Yeah. Good luck. Exactly.
To kind of answer the question, and then like the best way I can is, so as a just me, I would always prefer to be the team that is slightly more greedy. Right, if your composition spikes at 15 minutes, I want my composition to spike at 15 minutes and 1 second. Right.
That's a good way to put it.
Obviously,
and,
it's not possible, but like as close to 15 as possible.
Yeah, and of course, like nothing survives contact with the enemy, right? But the idea is like, at our level, and I also believe this is true at the pro levels, if you could somehow get a composition where you will be slightly stronger than them, immediately after their power spike and you can maintain that for the rest of the game, that composition should always win because the window is too small for the team that spikes earlier to abuse it. In practice, that's not possible, right?
The most extreme example of that actually is when you're just always stronger no matter what. I mean, if you can
Ideally,
outscale them from 1 second into the game and you're just always stronger the rest of the game, then they have no chance. So that's like, obviously the way League of Legends is balanced, the point is that you can't do that. If you were just always stronger with some character, then that would be a really stupid game.
Yeah.
But that's like you're aiming for that, right? So you're trying to be stronger as soon as like they're stronger for as little time as possible, and then you're stronger the rest of the time. And that's what he's trying to do.
Exactly. But the more realistic thing is, because like if I could see your 5 champions, and I had sufficient time, I could always come up with a set of 5 champions that could be as close as possible to accomplishing that. If I had unlimited time to think about it, right? But realistically, what we tend to try and do is we tend to want to be really strong around 1.5 to 2.5 items, and just control geography, because it's something that we do better than just about any other team, and it's something that we're good at, and it's something that is easy to draft. But the thing about that is you can do that with almost any 5 reasonable champions, right? As long as you aren't picking really weird things that aren't popular because they are so focused on doing like one thing or another, your composition is going to be at least okay at controlling choke points. And as long as we can do that, we're generally pretty happy. So that's how we tend to look at it.
Okay.
I think the champions, if you could pick the champions that you play, and to some extent you can because you get to practice throughout the season, you want to pick characters that do things that are similar, so you don't have to like bend your entire game plan if you want to pick this one really weird thing. You want to have like, oh, we pick, all these champions do kind of the same thing, so we can pick any of them based on the matchup and the exact game that we're in.
As a brief aside on what just happened on screen, I was so sad about this because Rafa and Zenzen were like 5 seconds too late to kill both of you here.
Feels bad.
So you want the champions that are like the same enough that you can sort of always pick them, but different enough that like they can't pick one thing to counter all of it. So there's sort of this balancing act of like, I play five or 6 characters. They're all similar. They all, just barely outscale,
like
or they're all,
Leo,
really
not Thresh.
Yeah, or they all are the beatdown early. I play Lissandra, Malzahar, Annie, and they all just CC you in mid lane, and they don't really play the game. Like, what kind of mid lane would play those 3 characters? I don't know. Probably Simple Luck. But different enough. Like Annie is sort of the bigger scaling character, and Lissandra is really strong earlier in the game. So they do the same thing compositionally, and you're always trying to CC them until they die. But they're slightly stronger at different points in the game, and that means that their matchup spread is just different enough that you can't just like always pick, I don't know, Syndra and counter all of them. Like that doesn't work. So you want to have them be just different enough that you can't get hard countered, but the same enough that you can pick them in any comp that you're trying to draft. And if all of your champion pools are like that'd be ideal, because then you can just like pick the best character in freelancer champion pool or in Ahntye's champion pool. It's like, well, this is the best one, and all my champions when they group up do the same thing, so I'll just pick the best one from my lane matchup.
Right. I think that all I can really say about RLS in terms of like our ideal drafts, a lot of the time we have a bunch of contingency plans set up, and I kind of really want to play a bunch of different drafts, but then teams just don't ban what we expect them to ban, and we just go with our first choice anyway.
Well, see, but honestly, I wasn't talking about RLS, Rex, and Yubi. I was talking about like you personally as a player. Like, what do you like to play, kind of a thing.
My personal ideal draft is exactly what we drafted in our very last game against COF, which is where I get a Shen ult, a Sivir ult, a Galio ult, and a Yuumi on top of me, and I'm really strong. That's really fun.
So you just get to be big man.
I think that the answer is generally just going to be one that allows me to play League of Legends.
Yeah,
that is the most important.
I again can't answer that because it's one of the strats.
It's so close to what you want to do.
Don't lie. You just get to play Gnar and get really fed. That's your ideal game.
Well,
that's what's been happening.
in terms of
So-
maximizing personal utility, yeah. But in terms of like maximizing my chances of winning and thereby the net utility, no.
It's
Oh,
you
yeah,
get
I totally-
to scoop Chris Sunga into your team as many times as possible for your montage.
I totally get that because, for example, you know, in Mythic, right, I had 0 complaints through all of Mythic, right? I played Ornn basically every single game last season. I don't mind it, you know? I don't mind playing weak side top. I don't mind playing, you know, a super tank like that. And we have a very different team compositions that you see here in, you know, in the Helios League. And as you can tell, you know, a lot of it's just going to be like, hey, personally, I just want to play whatever I think that is going to be most beneficial to my team. And if that's going to be some weak side tank in top lane, then it's going to be that. And that's going to be some hard carry in top lane. Like, sure, as long as it works. I personally am a very, you know, for the team kind of player. Like, my teammates might not necessarily agree, but that's my own thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm playing for the team. I think the normal connotation is you're giving things up, but that's not always true. I mean, sometimes playing for the team means that you should be the strongest one.
Yeah.
You know, if you think that in a given matchup, like, oh, they just have a weak jungler, like maybe it should be my job in that particular game to be the carry.
For example, Arles, the Ruby League server, where the name originally came from, we would have 5v5s, and a lot of the times I would get slotted into AD carry because we have very few AD carry players. And one of the things that I would do in these 5v5 in-houses is once we get to the later stages of the game, I'd be like, okay, well, I don't really care what AD carry I play, but what helps the team the most? You know, I'm just gonna pick Sivir or Jhin or you know, Lucian, right?
And I think that actually comes back to, it applies to draft, but it's just a general League of Legends concept, is what matters the most is being relatively stronger and not so as much as possible. So that can be player skill. So if relatively, like, the difference in rank between like my top lane and their top lane that's the biggest thing on the team, then I should be drafting to make my top laner the strongest thing in the game, because that's where my biggest skill gap is. But that also applies to champions. Like, maybe you know, overall my character is strongest on 3 items, but so is theirs, and like the relative difference in our strength is actually at 2 items, even though I'm not quite as strong as I would be eventually. That's when you should be taking fights, that these relative strengths. And that applies to team comp. So, you know, maybe I'm picking a champion that's not good at split pushing. Like, I don't know, what's a mediocre split pusher? Volibear's actually not that good at split pushing. Like, he's fine, but he's not like
He's okay.
he's not a dedicated. He's not Fiora.
He's not
but he's,
Tryndamere.
right, but he's against, in this case, he's against a Tahm Kench, and Tahm Kench is even worse at split pushing.
Yeah.
So in this game, Volibear became a split pusher to some extent because he's relatively better at it than Tahm Kench, even though you wouldn't call Volibear a split pushing top laner. So there's, I think, relative advantage is much more important than any kind of absolute advantage if you're looking at League of Legends in general, but it comes to drafting as well.
There's that economics major coming in.
There's that economics. All right. So
While you're
with that,
talking about comparative advantage.
exactly. Well, hey, it's like sometimes that's what you got to do. You got to compare advantages. So I was originally, I know we were running kind of late here, so we can do one of 2 things. We can either talk about the playoff games that we got coming up, which is Arles versus CFG, and another one I'm blanking off the top of my head. Or I was gonna say we could talk, because I initially wanted to talk about Clash, but like what your strategies are for drafting in Clash, because that's kind of like
Clash
draft.
Clash is, I think, really quickly, think Clash is OPGG your opponents and ban the things they have the most games on, because you don't have enough time to like actually watch their games and like see what they do. And most people in solo queue are one tricks, so you just ban the one tricks and hopefully that's good enough. You have no other information to go on.
I don't
give
think
it
I ever tried to
slightly
win in
different.
Clash.
You don't ever try to win in Clash. You just play what's fun.
I try very hard to win in Clash.
The thing is, like, you know, I come from a fighting game background, and one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was nobody cares who wins in friendlies, right?
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter if you win or lose in a game of Clash, as long as you learn something from it.
I
And
disagree. I think Clash is. I don't think Clash is a friendly. That's what my
Yeah.
Flex 5v5
I mean,
and
like,
normal games are for.
honestly, like, a lot of the time, the reason why we don't tend to take Clash that seriously in terms of, purely trying to win, is because us as, 5 members of our team tend to find it difficult to find everyone together at the same time. So when we do have time to play Clash, we're like, okay, well, this is basically a scrim for us. Let's try to see what fits. Let's try to see what works. Let's make sure if the compositions that we already do have work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, the one thing I would change about Utility Monsters thing, and for what it's worth, I still have like an hour before I gotta head out or anything. So if you want to take more time, we're good. But I would say ban things that you don't think you can play against, and a lot of the time that is their best champions. But sometimes it's like, yo, this guy, he plays a lot of Xin Zhao, but we know how to play against Xin Zhao. We don't know how to play against his fucking Shaco. So we're gonna get rid of that, right?
See, and that's what I mean. It's like there was this other question where it's like where you look at player performance that I was kind of like, are you gonna basically ban out the #1 played champion that a player has? Or is it that one Shaco that keeps popping up and is always like 7-0 and 10 or
every single Clash game I've ever played is like 2 1-tricks and then one person who plays a champion doesn't.
I don't even mean just in Clash. I just mean in general, like during your other drafts too. It's like you're looking at someone's op.gg and they've got like Xin Zhao, Shaco, and Diana, but let's say their Diana is absolute, like every single time it's like 0-12 and 3 or 0-14 and 1. So it doesn't do very well. But then you look at their Xin Zhao and it's like 20 out of the 30 games are Xin Zhao, and there's those 3 Shaco games where it's 21-0 and 2 or 15-1 and 9. It's like, are you gonna ban that out, or is that you're like?
Usually not, right? Like if it's that extreme where they are only playing it like 10% of the time, we're probably going to ban something else, because it's just a situation where, this champion is considered bad in 5s for a reason. So, we can probably deal with it. But, if I have to pick, let's say they have like 15 games on Xin Zhao and 15 games on Shaco, I'm going to ban the Shaco because, again, it's hard to play against. It's weird to play against, whereas Xin Zhao is very straightforward. We know this champion, and so that's why I've kind of criticized some other teams for like banning Minar. On the one hand, yes, Minar is by far my best champion, but there are ways to beat it, right? Like you can play certain champions. I think the one that Ahntye knows very well is I used to play Nar into Irelia. That is not happening. Right?
We had a game where we were actually, we were playing against each other, and I leave Nar open on the first ban. I ban not Nar, and he immediately bans Irelia. I'm just like,
I'm not doing it. It's not worth it. It's not fun. It's not good practice.
It's a lot of fun for me.
For you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. OP.GG is essentially.
I think Clash, you have just a little information. You just ban what they're comfortable at and hope that's good enough.
Okay. Well, okay, so let's hop right in here then to these playoff games that we got coming up, the quarterfinals. Gonna get kind of excited. We got RLS versus CFG is gonna be the first one up, which I know you're not too terribly stoked by, Ahntye, because it's basically playing a whole new roster.
Yeah, CFG, well, you've seen a few games from a few of the players, like, 1 or 2 games here and there. Basically all 5 players are different, because even in the regular season, right, we saw Sadis playing more often, and the last game that they did play, Sadis wasn't playing. And looking into the team, that I believe that Sadis also is not going to be playing in playoffs. I'm not 100% certain on that, so don't quote me on that. But if that is the case, what in the world? This is
You're
something.
Just confused and sure.
This is something.
Okay. Yeah, there is that, and it's a best of 5. So
is it best of 5 or best of 3?
Best of 5.
Best of 5.
That is much nicer.
Yeah. So with it being a best of 5, how does that change your drafting strategy? Does it kind of like, do you go, okay, we're going to expect them to play these particular comps in that first draft, and so you do a particular thing there and then change it up as you go in?
So one of the things that I will say, once again, I have a background in fighting games. So one of the big things that I learned is when you are playing, you are not playing to win the game. You are playing to win the set. So it does not matter if you lose a game. right? If you're losing a game and if you're losing it hard, cool, it happens. You have two options, especially if it's a best of 5. It's significantly, more viable to just straight up throw away the game for the sake of your mental, right? If you don't believe that it's possible to win the game in a way that's will keep you like mentally, fresh for the next one, then sometimes it's just not worth it to go for overly trying at one thing. And one thing I also will say is that every game that you play is more information that you gain on the enemy team. And like I said, pre-draft, the more information you have, the better position you're in, and it's all going to change how you draft and how you play.
I think that it comes down to just having more draft strategies available to you, because it's likely that if you're playing best of ones, which is what we've mostly been talking about, I think, it's like, oh, I'm going to ban these 3 things that they play that I don't play that I think, are strong if they play them. And then I'll pick the things that are contested, and then, we'll have a good draft. In a best of 5, if they have a surprise in an earlier game, like, in the RLS Rex game that we were talking about earlier, like, oh, they played Trundle into Xin Zhao, and that's a really good matchup, and so we can't pick Xin Zhao anymore. Well, now suddenly, if you want to pick Xin Zhao, you have to ban Trundle. So you need to, which is fine, because you have more games that you can't just ban Trundle and then do the same thing again and see what the next plan is. But that means that suddenly, before we were banning Aurelia, and now we're going to let Aurelia through. So we need to have an alternate plan for what if we have. So I call them flex bans. Like, maybe there's 1 or 2 things that we know we can never let through the entire series. But most of the time, it's like, we can never let through this one thing, and then we have 2 things that's like, these are the worst 2 things I think now. Later in the series, it's going to be different things. So what that means is you need to have draft plans for your default. Like, okay, so by default, we're banning Irelia and we're picking Gnar every time. But later in the draft, like, oh, we have to ban Trundle now. We can't ban Aurelia anymore. And so now your plan goes from picking Gnar every time to picking Ornn every time, or hiding top lane until later and blind picking a safe mid laner, right? So you should have more draft plans, because you know that you will have to let things through. But I don't think that the logic for any of those draft plans changes. I think you just have more options, because you know that some things can come up you don't expect. And at some level, like, you just ban it. Like, that's by far the easiest thing. It's like, oh, I didn't expect that thing, I'm just banning it. I have a draft plan for the other thing.
So.
Yep. Yeah. I already have a draft plan for in case they had something like this anyway. So I'll deal with Aurelia. I don't want to deal with Trundle.
Yeah, I think the one other thing to add is that for playoffs, Rex is probably going to have about 3 primary strategies that we're going to be going in, and they will work better on one side of the map versus the other. And so it's the kind of thing where you want to make sure that you keep these open to yourself. So it's like, oh, we got our first 3 picks. Okay, well, now we're going to slam X and Y, because what are you going to do against it? You need to prove that you can play against this composition, or you're going to have to ban it. And that will allow us to pick, other things that we like to play. So if we really like playing one strategy in game 1, or, kind of like a cheesy strategy that you haven't seen us play before, and you can't really expect coming, now it gives you this really big spot where you don't know what to ban in future games, because you were banning the way you thought we played. And of course we can play that way, but now we've shown that we can also play this other way that you're now going to have to deal with. So there's a lot more mind games that go into the first couple of games in order to try and get that first win, right? Because once you have that initiative in the series, it is absolutely huge for dictating how the rest of the series will go.
I think you can look at our draft plan from last season, so you can see what we did in playoffs. We would basically have a default plan for red and blue side, and it was different not because we had different priorities on champions, but because you can hide more things. So you can pick riskier things on red side because you can last pick it so they can't counter it. So I think, for example, we had a game, one of our games, we were willing to pick Kayle. And Kayle is really weak laning, so you can't pick Kayle on blue side very easily into most top laners, because they'll pick something that just beats really hard in lane. So we had a Kayle draft, but it was like a red side draft only. And that was an option. But we had a default red side draft, a default blue side draft, and then we had a couple alternate drafts for if someone on the team had a good or bad game. So we had a draft one game, I think it was against Ahntye, and Bow Explode is really good. And I think I'm also really good. So most of our default drafts were like, oh, we're just gonna pick normal stuff and we'll duke it out. But we had an alternate draft for if Bow Explode just absolutely murders me every game. And the alternate draft was I pick Skarner, right? That's the alternate draft is it's fine. Like I'll just play Skarner, I'll play for the team. And you should have that, right? We also had an alternate draft for like if our bot lane is like our bot lane is really good. So if our bot lane is just popping off and everyone else on the team is like running it, we're picking Senna because then Brian is farming in addition to Jeff getting souls, and we have 2 insane carries in bot lane, and everyone else is just like playing support the bot lane. So and then we had a reverse, like we had a Kale draft, like I was saying. So it's like, oh, if Freelance is having an amazing game, we're picking him Kale, and we're giving him all the agency of the game. We're just going to do nothing until he carries us to win the game. So we had sort of all these contingency plans for like, what if someone has a good or bad game, and those were related to what we're banning or not banning. So if we're banning top laners to begin, and then it's like, oh, actually, their top laner's not playing very well, we can drop these top bans and ban mid laners instead. We need to have sort of this alternate plan for our top laners playing well, but they have, these new picks to deal with, stuff like that. Okay. So it's more about, it still comes back to sort of what you're letting through and who's playing well, but it's still all prep. It's still like, oh, we have 5 drafts that we're coming in with. We're gonna play one of these 5, and it's just which one you pick. And like there's small variants, like this draft can have a Nautilus or a Leona. They're the same champion.
Yes, it does very similar things. It's just it's slightly different in how they do it.
Yeah, okay. So it's not like our drafts are not like 5 champions drafts. It's like 5. It's 5 drafts of like styles, but 5,
and then you got a side deck. So
yeah, it's sort of these are our 5 drafts, and every single role of these 5 drafts has 3 options. So something like that.
All right. So obviously RLS versus CFG is going to be a CFG win. So we're pretty certain of that for our predictions, wise.
I gave my predictions in the power ranking, so I think CFG has I give them a 15% chance to win the series.
The series?
The series.
Okay.
So what are we looking at for INT versus PT?
I gave PTP a 5% chance. I think INT is just much better individually, and PTP might take games off of them. I wouldn't be shocked if INT drops a game, but I think it'll be really hard for PTP to win 3. INT is just outside of maybe mid lane, I think they're just.
So what you're telling me is that's going to be our 5 game day. And that's going to be our day. That's going to be like 6 hours long. Cool.
I think RLS CFG is good. Like if there's going to be a close series in one of these, it's going to be that one.
Okay,
I agree.
I don't know. All I'm going to say is I am going to put the same amount of draft prep into this that I have done into every team, which is as much as physically possible.
Yeah, but the problem is with CFG, like there's, as you said earlier, like there's just not.
There is so little information.
There's an X factor. Exactly. There's some unknowns that
so you have to take that into account when you're doing these predictions. So I think RLS is favored, and individually, I think they'll do fine, and it's unlikely that CFG comes up with something, but it's possible that CFG, they have a couple picks with it they haven't shown yet, and turns out are really problematic, and maybe RLS can't adapt in time, and they lose a series, and it's like. Maybe it's the type of thing even where RLS would have won if they'd known going in, but it's sort of it's almost an unfair advantage that CFG, gets to have a new roster 2 weeks before the season ends. It's like
it's what it is.
It happens, but
yeah. The thing I'll say about INT versus PTP, and I try not to talk about this a whole lot, but watch the Rex versus PTP game if you have a chance. There's some very telling things that happen in that game. As to like why I do not think PTP is likely to win against INT unless INT just has a bad day, which might happen.
Is that the game where you won 4v5?
Yeah.
I don't know. All I will say about INT versus PTP is INT are a phenomenal team when they are playing properly. Their drafting confuses me, and sometimes they just run it.
So now INT does not watch this podcast on how to draft. Oh. They show up to draft with no prep, and they pick whatever they feel like, and it just turns out that they're really good. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, sometimes INT will randomly do things like, Everfrost Rush on Rel. But, like, it was a second item, I'm pretty sure. My bad. All I'm going to say
Sorry, it's not first, it's second.
INT have an X factor where they just randomly throw away their own chances.
Mm-hmm. I think against PTP that's unlikely to happen. I think
there are a lot of curveballs.
I think it tends to happen more against teams that are sort of more evenly matched, where they can do things that end up losing themselves the game. I think if you're just so likely to get individual leads, you're less likely to run into cases where you throw away the game.
Nope, we'll see how it goes.
Definitely will. All right. With that,
and
that's
just to double back to RLS CFG, the one disadvantage, of course, of only having this team together for 2 weeks is they haven't played together very much.
Yeah.
So the expectation is that RLS is just the more coordinated team, and barring surprises, they just are individually at least even, if not better, and then play the map better. So that's sort of why we think RLS is favored. We just give CFG more of a spoiler chance because we don't know much about them.
Gotcha. That's honestly, that's fair, because as it is a situation where it's like if it's an unknown, there's really not so much you can say about it.
Mm-hmm.
You guys got anything else? You want me to just kind of leave you the mic to talk for a little bit and I step away, or we good?
Joushi ain't shit.
Oh, it was said.
I can't make a montage. The only way I can make a montage about this is if when you sub for us, like I actively just like leave you to die.
I think what we should do actually is have you guys get first, and then we get first, and we play each other in super finals, and then you can make a montage after it of me killing you over and over.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, true.
Yeah, you see, the problem with that is that having Rex get first makes it really hard for RLS to get first.
Oh, that's true.
It is very true.
Maybe you guys could do like a tied first. Maybe you guys could like get two and two
hear
finals, and then you both just like refuse to play.
Right. Well, I could also kind of hear Oriri kind of yelling off in the background. So it's like not to forget about Terracotta, because honestly, Terracotta's been doing pretty damn good. So it's going to be a team to watch out for.
Yeah.
No team to sleep on.
All I know is that these playoffs are going to be freaking hype. I am excited. I am like, there is just so much, like this RLS CFG game I'm excited for, just because again, it's CFG's an unknown. RLS, we know your guys are pretty damn good. Ahntye versus PTP. I'm excited to see the matchup between the two old guard. But just in general, Rex and Terracotta already sitting in the semis. That means we're going to have a really crazy final. And then we got Luna next week, which is going to be even, like, it's going to be its own thing too. So we got UB just going to kind of, not expecting a clean sweep. I'm expecting somebody to give you some pressure. HBK, looking at you guys. But
we're still undefeated in games where we play all 5 starters.
This is true. Although Jeff God, is he going to be ready?
That's confidential information, but probably, yeah.
Confidential information, but probably. Okay. All right. We'll make sure that only the lounge knows.
Okay.
Yeah.
Only the lounge. It's confidential between us. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, thank you guys so much. I think this was a really, really good one. I actually kind of want to do this again at some point, like talking more about like league strategy rather than just previous games, because I think
the economics of League of Legends.
The economics of League of Legends.
Gold makes gold.
Gold makes gold. is very true. All right, so we'll give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Logitech Gaming and Adobe Creative Cloud. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate your support. And then once again, remember to tune in on Thursday, October 14th for our first semifinal game. It's going to be a best of 5 between RLS and CFG. Probably going to be a long one. It'll be starting at 4:30 Pacific time like usual. That's going to be really, really exciting. And then we've got our quarterfinals with Ahntye versus BTP on the 15th. Again, same time on FoF, twitch.tv/FoF Esports. Be sure to check it out. We're looking forward to seeing you out on the Rift. Have a great night.